Not long after the 1965 publishing of Frank Herbert's sprawling, best-selling science fiction novel, Dune, early attempts were made at adapting the book into a film. A movie option was originally purchased in 1971 by producer Arthur P. Jacobs, which went into the early stages of development with Lawrence of Arabia director David Lean attached to direct. Jacobs, however, tragically passed away in 1973, reverting the rights temporarily until they were purchased by a French film group that tasked director Alejandro Jodorowsky with developing Dune in 1974. Jodorowsky won fame and infamy for his acid western films like El Topo, and in developing his version of Dune, he veered heavily away from Herbert's novels. By then, Herbert had already written his first of 5 Dune sequels, Dune, Messiah, but Jodorowsky was on his own path, taking plenty of artistic license in development, covered extensively in the engaging documentary Jodorowsky's Dune. Much ink has been spilled on Jodorowsky's unrealized version, as well as the oft-derided David Lynch version of the film that eventually made it to screens in 1984. What is seldom discussed, however, was the brief period when director Ridley Scott, riding high between Alien and Blade Runner, was set to direct Dune, how Ridley Scott's Dune could have advanced Alejandro Jodorowsky's prep work. While the what-ifs surrounding Jodorowsky's avant-garde approach to Dune and David Lynch's studio sabotage box office bomb in 1984 have gotten plenty of analysis from critics and cinephiles alike, a Ridley Scott version may have had the most potential. That's because Scott was in the prime of his science fiction filmmaking after shocking audiences with the deep space horror known as Alien in 1979. Only 3 years earlier, in 1976, legendary producer Dino De Laurentiis had purchased the rights to Dune from Jodorowsky's backers after the Mexican director's failed attempt to bring Herbert's story to screens. In the spring of '79, Ridley Scott's Alien pushed all the boundaries of science fiction by adapting H.R. Giger's nightmarish artwork into a successful space horror. De Laurentiis set his sights on Scott as a potential Dune director, understanding the British director's mastery of the genre. Scott used H.R. Giger's artwork for his version of Dune. One thing Scott's version retained from Jodorowsky's Dune development was the horrific art of Swiss airbrush master H.R. Giger, but Jodorowsky cared much more about making art than entertaining audiences, precisely the skill that Scott had in spades. Scott went into development on Dune in late 1979, facing the ever-present issue of developing Frank Herbert's dense novels into a succinct 2-hour feature, an issue that remained a challenge for director Denis Villeneuve 40 years later. A bigger issue, yet, for Ridley Scott was some personal turmoil he faced during this late-70s period of development, as well as his greater desire to adapt another science fiction property, Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which eventually became Blade Runner. Elements of Scott's Dune development presaged Denis Villeneuve's later adaptation. Over the years, Ridley Scott has cited several reasons for his abandonment of Dune, but in late 1979, Scott began development on the project, hiring novelist and screenwriter Rudy Wurlitzer to pen the script. Wurlitzer had already been a scribe for 2 notable films, Two Lane Blacktop and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Both films underperformed, but Wurlitzer still managed a first draft of Dune, which Ridley Scott felt was a decent distillation of Frank Herbert's novels. Herbert himself had attempted a script for De Laurentiis in 1978, which would have run over 3 hours had it made it to screens. Scott had intended to split the first book into 2 movies, much like Denis Villeneuve has done with his current, and very successful, film incarnations of Dune. The problem was that the development process was moving slowly, and Scott knew that his boss, De Laurentiis, preferred his films to be produced on time and under budget.